Can you hear me, Brian? Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Just
All right, so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about irrigated grain sorghum. As you should know, unless you've been in a bubble for the last 6 months, Milo prices are up, and that's what's really driving this discussion. When I first came here, I started doing some work on irrigation on Milo like 2009, 10, 11, and then did some economic analysis that we'll discuss on data collected from like 12 to 15, 16. But over those years, you know, if we managed the water correctly and had a good hybrid, we could easily reach 140 bushel Milo plus with less stress on our irrigation systems, because we're pumping much less water, and this is in the panhandle and where we might have limited water. If we're trying to grow corn on the limited water, we really have to keep up with some things, whereas Milo, it's a little more resilient, and we can get away with doing things a little different as far as on low water because of the way it can rebound from stress. Corn, you know, if we stress it too long, it won't rebound, whereas Milo, it'll actually rebound quicker after a drought period or a dry period. And so that's where we can do things with it. Really, per bushel on average, it uses the same amount of total water. It's just capable of using more of the soil water than what corn is, because it can go deeper. And again, it can respond from stress. So you can force it to go deeper with that moderate stress. Production costs are lower, primarily seed. And then when you're looking at a lower production goal or yield goal, you're looking at lower nitrogen requirements and lower irrigation costs. And so all those things tie in to reducing that cost, which will go into the economics. And a lot of guys, you know, you think about just maximizing bushels, but Darren alluded to it, maximizing bushels is not maximizing profit. And Milo is something right now where we're at on the price where we could really improve our profit per acre, even with lower yields with the Milo. It also provides some opportunity. I'm not going to get into it too deep. I got to develop some data for the Red River Crop School on this concept of sharing water with cotton and soybeans, because if you look at the water use, if we can plant that Milo early, then we can transition to a field of cotton and soybeans during their primary water demand off of the Milo, and probably get away with some pretty good yields, because the Milo is going to need that water earlier if we plant it in April, or even southern Oklahoma in maybe late March. I don't know if you can get away with that or not. Very good if you're sharing water, limited water, like I say, and that's where I'm at, is if you're sharing water and you have a late season crop like late July, August, that needs water, then you might be able to turn that Milo off if you can get it planted early, because its water demand, once it's started to fill in grain, starts to subside. It seems like another reason is, it seems to me like the high plains, at least last year and looking at this year, far western high plains are transitioning to a drier cycle than we've been. And we have very good data supporting Milo economics under limited water when prices are within 10% of corn. And I'll share some of that Art Stoker, an economist in Ag Econ, did for me. And then Milo is at a premium. So you look at that with we're within 10% of corn price, then below or at 400 gallons a minute, at least in the panhandle, we can be profitable, comparable to corn, comparatively profitable to corn, and we'll show some of that here in a minute. But one of the first things I want to point out is one of the reasons why I started looking at this is, you know, Rick Croak and I collected all this data when he was in the panhandle, and these are hybrid performance trials that were located out there. And these are just the average yields for corn and the average yields for Milo. And I've circled 2011 that was a particularly challenging year for corn because of heat and drought. And they were only able to put 21 inches on this corn, and they ended up with 85 bushel. And on the Milo, they ended up with 10 inches of irrigation on the Milo and had 166 bushel Milo. And that was very striking. And this is average across all hybrids. So it's very striking to me, and it kind of set me in motion on doing a lot of the work that we'll discuss. But this right here tells us that, you know, there's conditions that are very harsh that can happen periodically in the panhandle. And when we have Milo out there and we're on a good soil like that Gruber clay loam and things work out, we can be very successful, even though the condition is such that corn will just fall on its face. And there's some years in here where Milo fell on its face. We had 92 bushels in 2007, but that they just underwatered with 4 inches of water. And then the corn yields weren't that good either. And I would say, you know, we were moving yields up after that, 12, 13, and 14 on corn, 240 to 230 bushel corn. But then we're still pushing 150 bushel Milo with essentially half the water. And so when we think about long-term economics, if we can maintain a year-to-year profitability, and we're pumping half the water, we extend the life of that water and extend the long-term net present value of the farm. And so we're actually increasing long-term profit. And we won't get into that, but I just wanted to share that's where that concept is coming from. And here's some actual irrigation data where we look at various rates of irrigation based on capacity from 200 to 800 gallons a minute for corn and from 100 to 600 gallons a minute on Milo. And there's a lot of range in here. This is data that was used to calibrate these economic models along with the variety trials. And so, you know, 2013, I got caught short on the water on the corn. So we were only at 180 bushel. And then 2014 and 15, you know, 190, 220 bushel corn. This was achieved, I think, with 1151 or 1197, I think. And then on the Milo, again, it ranged from 100, you know, as little as 90 up to 170 bushel, depending on the year and the irrigation schedule. What's interesting is 2015, you know, 100 gallons a minute, 5 inches was 150 bushel, which is really good Milo. And then we had, you know, you had 10 inches of additional water, you could get it up to 172 bushel. It is that 20 bushels really worth that 10 inches of water. And as Darren suggested, you know, you might be maximizing yield, but your efficiency is very poor. And so there's a balance in there for Milo, just the same as it is. So just real quick, this is a initial economic analysis. This is 10 years worth of price data averaged for corn and Milo. So back then when they did this, it was 448 for corn and 416 for Milo. And this is what we would get. We would see that just under 5 gallons per minute per acre, we would see that Milo, as we went down in capacity, would become more profitable than corn on a year-to-year basis. And then the aphid hit, so I added this analysis, and you add the cost of that Savanto, then it becomes more challenging for the Milo to be more profitable than corn. But as we get down to lower capacities, one of the challenges is it's hard to pump those kind of capacities through a quarter-mile pivot, and so there becomes a challenge when you get below 200 or 300 gallons a minute. But again, theoretically, Milo can become more profitable because it's more resilient to periodic drought stress, and it's cheaper to grow. And then when we look at the net revenue, this should be per inch of water. I'm sorry. Yeah, per inch of irrigation. The y-axis is wrong. That should be dollars per inch of water. You see that in every capacity, the Milo is more profitable per inch of water. So if you're water limited and you have a long-term perspective, you need to think about this, is that can you sacrifice a little current return for a longer return into the future? And will that water be conserved under your ground is another issue that we won't discuss today, but we've analyzed that, and it can to some extent. But long and short, when we look at the water productivity of Milo is fundamentally better than corn at all irrigation capacities. And it's more a water profitability. And it's because, again, it's cheaper to grow and it can take advantage of stored soil moisture more effectively than corn. And then now you fast forward to 2021 and you look at the current contracts that you could sign today to sell corn and Milo at $4.11 or $4.41. This is downstate prices. Out in the Panhandle, it's going to be a little higher for both because of the positive basis for both. But you got a 30-cent premium, and then in just replacing those prices into that economic analysis with the ones that were there on a per acre basis, Milo wins even at 220 bushel corn versus 170, 160 bushel Milo at the highest irrigation. And that's simply because the price is higher and the costs are cheaper. And just to give you an idea, we're looking at $100 worth of seed for the corn and $16 worth of seed for the Milo. And then when you look at 170, 160 bushel Milo, you're looking at reduced N rates and then reduced water even at the highest capacity. And all that comes into play in the economics. And this is cost of pumping water in the Panhandle where we've got natural gas. You figure everything, irrigation costs about $10 an inch is what we figure. And if you're in areas where you've got electric power pumping and your pumping costs are much higher than that, then it's going to be more advantageous because you'll be pumping less water. And that's I don't get a lot of details into the economics, especially when we're at a statewide discussion or even a regional discussion, because so many of these input costs can be so much different for people depending on where they're at. This is just an example of what we see. And just right quick on how much water it's going to take. Here is, a bunch of data and where we look at yield as a percent of ET supplied by rain and irrigation. And if we, on average, supply 90% of the ET as rain or irrigation, we're going to achieve full yield. If we go over that, we're not going to gain much. There are years like 2016 where we could have got by with maximizing yield at 70 to 80% of ET. But if we replace, and that's because we had better stored soil moisture, or we got deeper into the profile with our root extraction, it is a year-to-year difference in this. And here it is just on average inches of irrigation pumped. On average, if we pump 9 inches in good well on a groover clay loam, we're going to achieve our optimum yield. And just to move in to translate some of this to downstate, I developed, this is coming out in a fact sheet probably shortly after the first of the year, but I developed an analysis of soil water depletion that was then used to provide some guidance on how much irrigation you might expect to need and the irrigation capacities that you might need. And to start off with that, we really need to look at the irrigation depletion and how that depletion occurs based on planting date and location. And so here we have an April 15th planting date. And what I did is I took the Mesonet irrigation scheduling data and I manipulated that to give me a depletion of water within the system if I didn't irrigate at all. And so here at Altus, you'll see that it results in the most dramatic decline in water because it's down south and it's the evapotranspiration demand in that region's pretty high. And then at Blackwell, you have less of a depletion throughout the growing season. And then if we were to implement irrigation, and Darren showed some of that when he was talking about water budgets where he would see these irrigation events, but this is just ET minus rainfall is essentially how this is, it's rainfall minus ET with the negative axis on the y-axis, and then we also subtract drainage over here in the early part of the season, because if we get rain in excess of ET, then that's going to drain into the profile or run off, and the where that water goes during the early part of the season depends on how dry or wet the soil is before you plant. If you have a dry soil at planting, any of that rainfall is just going to drain into the soil and fill the profile. But if you have saturated conditions, then it may drain out the bottom of the rooting zone, or it may run off. And when we look at these averages, it's hard to know which of those would occur. But anyway, so we can certainly see that Blackwell has a slower and less deep depletion. So of course it's going to use less rain, or use less irrigation, and need less capacity to keep up with peak ET. And then when we look at a June planting, these values or these curves change a little bit, but the magnitude of the depletion doesn't change as much as what I thought it would. I was kind of surprised by that, because I thought a June planting, you'd have more depletion in all these locations because you're getting into the heat of the summer. But there's some things that play as far as rainfall patterns and the ET that result in there not being that much difference in the depletion. But the physiological growth stage at which that peak rate of depletion occurs is different. Essentially, when you plant in June, you're getting peak irrigation demands occurring at or before boot, and in June they're occurring after that, and that goes into why we want to plant in April, because if we're getting to peak irrigation demand prior to boot, that means we're going to need that capacity to keep up with the crop going into the most critical part of reproductive growth. Because there's two conditions where we want Milo to be wet or moist, very moist, and that's at 30 days after emergence, which is the growing point differentiation, and then at boot. And at those 2 points, we need plenty of water for that crop to think that it's in a good growing environment, and it's going to make a lot of seed, a lot of heads and a lot of seed per heads, and make high potential yields at those 2 points. And then post flowering, the ET actually goes down, and so the water demand the physiological demand for water goes down. And so depending on where we plant, it actually might be in better condition for water stress post flower than pre-boot. And that's where early April planting will be better, because it decreases the likelihood of getting behind at low capacity. And so here's just a table showing when we initiate irrigation, if we plant in April versus June in Altus and Woodward. And so Altus, we're going to start sooner than we are in Blackwell at both planting dates, because we're going to have more rainfall and less ET. Our peak ET is going to be higher in Altus versus Blackwell. They're going to occur at fairly similar times. They're somewhere between the middle of June and the end of June for all periods. And like I say, the peak ET occurs between boot and flower in April, and then it occurs prior to boot in June planting. So when it can occur during the reproductive period, but if it occurs before that, then that means we have to pump water to keep up in order to get to that moist condition at boot. And it just becomes more of a challenge when you think about the managerial requirements and the probabilities. If you have, these are numbers, all these numbers are based on average rainfall and ET. And so if you're below average, then you can get in trouble more often with that June planting, because you're already hitting peak ET before you actually get to the reproductive stages, I guess is the story. but surprisingly, the peak irrigation demand is not that much different. And then, like I say, if you look at the soil water deficits, they're very similar. It's just how you go into those reproductive conditions and the probabilities of being deficit. So here's just a simple ET curve, and I gotta get going, but one thing to notice on a June planting is this initial ET is 0.1 to 0.11, 0.12, and that's a period of time certainly well before canopy closure. In fact, there's very little canopy, if any, out there, and so most of that ET is really evaporation, and very little of it is transpiration. And so when you have those numbers of 0.1 to 0.2, and you compare them to June, which is about 0.6 to 0.09, that difference is really a greater evaporation in a June planting environment compared to an April planting, and that's unproductive water loss. Transpiration is productive and evaporation is unproductive, so we want to maximize the transpiration within that ET number. And we don't think about it, but if we have a bunch of bare ground out there and we have a high ET, it means we really have a high evaporative water loss. And so when we plant earlier, more of that, the ET is productive ET because there's less early prior to canopy closure. And then, of course, like I say, in a June planting, there's a fairly significant period of time there in mid to late July where we're at peak ET, but we haven't reached the boot stage. And that's because our atmospheric water demand is so high, even though our plants are not fully developed to reproductive growth. In contrast, we can go through a lot of the vegetative growth and then get into flowering before we hit a peak ET. And so we can at least get to that flowering stage, or at least to boot, before we really start pumping water out of the ground in April. And then throughout the reproductive growth stage, our ETs are declining because of physiological reductions in water demand. So just a few notes on managing irrigated Milo. Previous data suggests that we can achieve 140 to 150 bushel in Goodwill. I think we could expect those same yields downstate, anywhere in the state, depending on the year. But downstate, I encourage early planting, not only from a water dynamic standpoint, but from a crop management standpoint, and getting it out before we start to really get into some pest issues. And then we don't have so many problems getting it dried down if we plant early, and we can get it out before the cool, moist falls come in. Soil type matters. I didn't get into this because it becomes a rabbit hole, but sandy soils require more irrigation than loams and clay loams because they can't store that soil moisture that we get in the off season, and they can't store it as effectively between irrigation events. Hybrid and seeding rate selection is important, just like Darren mentioned, but that's really Josh's department. You know, I lean on him and the seed dealers as far as hybrid selection, because that's not my business. But we want to go for high yielding hybrids and that will perform in high yielding environments, because that's what we're wanting to create. And we want to make the bushels and be efficient with respect to hybrid productivity within the water capacities that we have. I like populations around 65,000, even at full water. We did a lot of population studies, and what we found is that we planted 65,000 seeds per acre, that we'd end up with 75,000 heads per acre. If we planted 100,000 seeds per acre, we'd end up with 70,000 seeds or heads per acre. And so that 65,000 seems to work pretty good. And then you can certainly adjust it down as you have less and less water, or if you're in a share water, you want to adjust that number down to add some resilience and cost cutting to it. And same thing for nitrogen, you manage it for yield goal and soil type. I always like to mention that you need to spend the money on pre-emerge and keep it clean, because irrigation on Milo will make the weeds a giant disaster if you don't control them with pre-emerge, because you think dryland weed pressure in Milo is a problem, just put a little water to it, and you can turn a problem into disaster really quick. And you're spending all this money on irrigation, so you've got to keep it clean to realize the benefits of that irrigation. And then scout for insects, of course, and use deep water applications to facilitate root growth and evaporation. I know there's a lot of folks downstate that'll put on like a quarter to a half inch per revolution of the pivot. Milo, that's the last thing you want to do to Milo. You want to slow the pivot down and put an inch on, or as much water as the soil will take per revolution, because the longer the period of time between applications, particularly early in the season, the better that Milo, the better opportunities that Milo will have to grow deep roots and take advantage of the entire profile. And then Milo price is very attractive and deserves a look on irrigated acres. It will require less irrigation than corn, which will reduce the pumping cost and or conserve water for future returns, and could serve as a good rotation, allowing for more effective sharing of water. And again, I haven't done the analysis on it, but when I think about where we need water for cotton and soybeans, it's not the same periods of the summer as what we would need that water for early planted Milo downstate. So there's some opportunity there if we're sharing water between pivots.